Every collapse starts the same way. Not with panic, not with sirens, not with people running. It begins quietly, almost politely, while everything still looks functional. Empires don't fall when systems break. They fall when systems keep working just enough to hide what's rotting underneath. That's the pattern. And it repeats so consistently that, in hindsight, it always feels obvious. But in the moment, it never does. Because collapse doesn't announce itself as collapse. It announces itself as normality stretched slightly too far. At the start, nothing feels wrong. Institutions still operate. Markets still open. Laws still exist. People still wake up, commute, argue about small things, and assume tomorrow will resemble yesterday. Stability doesn't disappear. It thins. And thinning is much harder to notice than breaking. The earliest stage is always behavioral. Long before numbers fail or structures crack, people quietly adjust their expectations. What once felt unacceptable becomes tolerable. What once felt temporary starts feeling permanent. Not because anyone decided it should, but because adapting feels safer than resisting. This is where the pattern locks in. When pressure builds inside a system, the system doesn't immediately collapse. It redistributes stress downward. Complexity increases. Explanations multiply. Responsibility becomes abstract. No single decision feels catastrophic. Each adjustment feels reasonable on its own. And that's the danger. Because collapse is not caused by a single failure. It's caused by millions of small accommodations to dysfunction. Each one reduces friction. Each one reduces visibility. Each one trains people to stop expecting resolution. At this stage, language changes before reality does. Words soften. Problems become transitions. Losses become adjustments. Structural weakness becomes resilience under strain. When language starts absorbing tension, behavior follows. People stop asking when things will return to normal and start asking how to live with less friction. The system rewards this. Compliance is efficient. Silence is efficient. Questioning slows things down. And slowing things down feels dangerous when everything depends on momentum. So momentum becomes sacred. The paradox is that systems collapse not because people stop believing in them, but because they believe just enough to keep participating. Participation without confidence. Loyalty without trust. Hope without expectation. That emotional state is incredibly stable. It can last years, sometimes decades. Historically, this is the longest phase. The calm before collapse is not calm. It's managed discomfort. It's the normalization of strain. It's when people sense something is wrong, but can't point to a single moment where things clearly broke. That ambiguity is not accidental. It's structural. Complex systems fail slowly because slowness protects legitimacy. Sudden failure invites accountability. Gradual failure invites adaptation. And adaptation shifts the burden away from the system and onto individuals. People internalize the cost. They work around inefficiencies. They lower standards. They tell themselves this is how things are everywhere now. And because everyone else is doing the same, the behavior reinforces itself. By the time collapse becomes visible, the psychological groundwork is already complete. Expectations have been lowered. Resistance has been softened. The system doesn't need to convince anyone anymore. People have convinced themselves. This is why every collapse starts the same way. Not with chaos, but with acceptance. Not with destruction, but with adjustment. And by the time the pattern becomes undeniable, the most important decisions have already been made silently by millions of people adapting one small step at a time. What comes next is not collapse itself, but consolidation. Once adaptation becomes a dominant behavior, systems enter a phase where surface order actually increases. Rules multiply. Procedures expand. Messaging becomes more confident. The appearance of control strengthens precisely because control is slipping underneath. This is another universal pattern. When a system senses fragility, it does not simplify. It complicates. It layers mechanisms on top of mechanisms, not to solve root problems, but to manage perception and delay consequences. From the outside, this looks like competence. From the inside, it feels like exhaustion. People begin spending more energy navigating the system than benefiting from it. At this stage, trust is replaced by compliance. Not because people agree, but because disagreement feels costly. The system doesn't need belief anymore. It needs predictability. And predictability comes from fatigue. Fatigue is powerful. It narrows focus. It shortens time horizons. It makes people prioritize immediate stability over long-term coherence. When individuals are tired, they stop asking whether something makes sense and start asking whether it will get them through the day. This is where psychology overtakes structure. The human mind is wired to normalize environments it cannot escape. When uncertainty becomes chronic, the brain reframes it as baseline. Stress becomes background noise. Signals that would once trigger alarm are filtered out as distractions. That filtering is fatal to systems, because systems rely on early detection. They rely on friction. They rely on discomfort being noticed and acted upon. When discomfort becomes familiar, feedback loops break. Problems no longer escalate upward. They dissipate sideways into private coping strategies. People stop organizing. They stop coordinating. They stop imagining alternatives. Not because alternatives are impossible, but because imagining them feels unrealistic inside a system that still appears intact. This is the illusion phase. From the outside, everything looks stable enough. From the inside, nothing feels solid. But no single moment justifies drastic action. And so nothing drastic happens. Historically, this is when elites misread reality most severely. They see continuity and assume legitimacy. They see participation and assume loyalty. They see silence and assume consent. But silence at this stage is not consent. It is calculation. People calculate risk constantly. They sense imbalance, but they also sense asymmetry. The cost of resistance feels immediate and personal. The cost of compliance feels distant and collective. So rational individuals choose a path that minimizes short-term exposure. And collectively, that choice accelerates collapse. Not because people are weak, but because systems are designed to externalize pain until the last possible moment. The system holds. Individuals bend. Another subtle shift happens here. Identity detaches from institutions. People still use them, but they stop identifying with them. They stop defending them emotionally. They stop feeling ownership. The relationship becomes transactional. That emotional withdrawal is invisible but decisive. Once people stop seeing a system as ours, they stop investing energy into its correction. Maintenance becomes someone else's responsibility. Accountability dissolves into abstraction. The system still stands, but no one feels responsible for its future. This is when collapse becomes inevitable, even though nothing dramatic has happened yet. Because systems don't collapse when they are hated. They collapse when they are tolerated. Tolerance is passive. It does not mobilize defense. It does not inspire reform. It simply endures until endurance runs out. And endurance always runs out. What follows tolerance is detachment, not rebellion, not outrage, something quieter. People begin to step back psychologically while remaining physically present. They still show up. They still comply. But their attention shifts elsewhere. Their emotional investment drains away. This stage is easy to miss because behavior hasn't changed much yet. What has changed is meaning. Work becomes mechanical. Participation becomes performative. Language becomes thinner. People repeat phrases without believing them. They use official words while privately translating them into something else. This is where systems lose narrative control. Every system relies on a shared story to function, not propaganda, but a basic agreement about why things exist and what they are for. When that story stops making sense, the system can still operate, but only on inertia. Inertia looks stable until it suddenly isn't. At this point, contradictions multiply. Rules contradict outcomes. Effort contradicts reward. Responsibility contradicts authority. People feel these contradictions daily, but they stop trying to resolve them. Resolution feels impossible. So contradictions coexist, unresolved and normalized. This normalization is crucial, because once contradictions are normalized, truth becomes optional, not in an ideological sense, but in a functional one. Accuracy loses priority to convenience. Precision gives way to signaling. Systems stop measuring reality and start managing reactions, and people adapt accordingly. They stop asking whether something is true and start asking whether it is safe to repeat. They stop evaluating outcomes and start reading atmospheres. Survival shifts from competence to perception management. This is not corruption in the classic sense. It is misalignment. The system's incentives drift away from its stated purpose. And when incentives drift, behavior follows. Even well-intentioned individuals end up reinforcing dysfunction because deviation carries risk while conformity carries cover. Cover matters more than correctness. Another psychological shift happens here. Time compresses. Long-term thinking feels abstract. Future consequences feel unreal. The present dominates decision-making because the present feels unstable enough on its own. This is how systems hollow out. They still have resources. They still have personnel. They still have authority. But they lose orientation. No one is steering toward a coherent future. Everyone is navigating locally. Local navigation cannot sustain global structure. Yet nothing collapses yet. In fact, systems often appear busiest at this stage. Activity increases. Communication accelerates. Initiatives proliferate. Motion substitutes for direction. Busyness creates the illusion of progress. But motion without alignment increases fragility. Small shocks start having outsized effects. Minor disruptions ripple unexpectedly, not because the shock is large, but because buffers are gone. Redundancy has been optimized away. Slack has been eliminated in the name of efficiency. Efficiency is brittle, and brittle systems don't announce failure. They fracture quietly under pressure that once would have been absorbed. Most people sense this before they can articulate it. They feel a constant low-grade tension, a sense that things shouldn't be this hard, that systems shouldn't require this much energy just to maintain normalcy. But feelings without language remain private, and private discomfort does not produce collective action. It produces withdrawal. This is the last calm stage before visible instability. Not because collapse is imminent, but because resilience is gone. The system is still standing. It just can't bend anymore. Before anything visibly breaks, there is a subtle transfer of responsibility. Institutions begin shifting risk downward. Decisions that were once centralized become ambiguously delegated. Authority remains the top, but accountability dissolves into layers. No one is fully responsible, yet everyone is partially exposed. This creates a specific kind of anxiety. People sense that consequences are real, but origins are unclear. When something goes wrong, there is no obvious source to blame, no clear lever to pull. Problems feel systemic, but are framed as individual failures. This mismatch quietly exhausts people. Exhaustion is not collapse. It is preparation for collapse. Because exhausted populations do not resist. They conserve energy. They adapt. They lower expectations. They begin to accept conditions they once would have rejected. Not because they agree, but because resistance feels futile. At this stage, stability becomes performative. Everything important still exists on paper. Laws, policies, standards, metrics, but enforcement becomes selective. Application becomes uneven. Outcomes depend more on positioning than on principle. People notice this, but again, they normalize it. Normalization is the most powerful stabilizer in late-stage systems. It allows dysfunction to persist without revolt. It reframes abnormal conditions as a new baseline. Language adjusts accordingly. Words like temporary, exceptional, and unprecedented are repeated until they lose meaning. Emergency becomes routine. Flexibility becomes permanent. Promises are rephrased, not fulfilled. And still, daily life continues. Children go to school. People go to work. Markets open. News cycles refresh. From the outside, nothing appears dramatically wrong. From the inside, almost everything feels heavier. This is where trust quietly relocates. People stop trusting systems and start trusting networks. Personal relationships matter more than institutions. Informal channels outperform official ones. Advice replaces rules. Reputation replaces credentials. This shift is adaptive, but it weakens the system further. Because systems rely on impersonality. They function when rules apply regardless of who you know. When trust becomes personal, the system loses scale. It becomes fragmented, uneven, and opaque. Fragmentation creates inequality of experience. Two people living under the same system can experience entirely different realities. One navigates smoothly through connections. The other collides endlessly with friction. This divergence erodes the idea of shared reality. Shared reality is the glue. Once it dissolves, coordination becomes difficult. Collective sacrifice becomes impossible. Everyone assumes others are gaming the system, so self-protection intensifies. Self-protection accelerates breakdown, not through chaos, but through optimization. People optimize locally, time, resources, exposure, without regard for systemic health. This is rational behavior in an environment where the system no longer reciprocates loyalty. The irony is that many still defend the system publicly, not because they believe in it, but because they fear what comes after. The unknown feels more dangerous than the flawed familiar. So narratives are defended long after they've lost credibility. This is the final psychological inversion. The system no longer protects people. People protect the system. And that protection is fragile. It depends on silence, compliance, and avoidance, not belief. Belief is already gone. What remains is momentum. And momentum, once detached from purpose, only moves in one direction. What finally arrives does not announce itself as an ending. There is no clear moment when people collectively realize something is over. Instead, there's a growing sense that effort no longer produces proportionate results. Work continues, but outcomes feel thinner. Rules still exist, but they no longer resolve conflicts. Participation persists, yet influence feels symbolic. This is not failure. It is hollowing. Systems rarely collapse outward first. They collapse inward. The structure remains standing while its internal logic decays. Functions exist without purpose. Processes repeat without conviction. What once coordinated behavior now merely records it. People adapt again. They disengage emotionally while staying operational. They follow procedures without expectation. Compliance replaces commitment. This creates the illusion of stability long after stability has vanished. From a distance, the system looks intact. This is why collapse is often misunderstood. Observers look for visible disorder, panic, violence, empty streets. But mature systems fail quietly. They fail through loss of meaning, not loss of order. Meaning is the invisible currency. When people believe their actions matter, systems regenerate. When that belief erodes, participation becomes mechanical. Mechanical participation sustains form, not function. At this stage, truth becomes negotiable, not because facts disappear, but because consensus does. Different groups operate with incompatible assumptions. Each feels rational within its own frame. Communication persists, but understanding collapses. This fragmentation does not trigger alarms. It triggers fatigue. Debate feels pointless. Explanation feels wasted. Silence feels safer. Over time, disengagement spreads, not as rebellion, but as retreat. Retreat is contagious. As more people withdraw psychologically, the system loses feedback. Signals weaken. Warnings arrive too late, or not at all. Leadership operates inside an echo chamber, mistaking quiet for consent. This is where reversals become impossible, not because solutions don't exist, but because coordination no longer does. Fixing complex systems requires shared sacrifice, shared narratives, shared trust. All three are gone. What replaces them is substitution. Symbols replace outcomes. Messaging replaces repair. Optics replace legitimacy. These substitutions work briefly. They create the sensation of control. But sensations do not restore structure. Eventually, even the substitutions lose power. People stop reacting. Not angrily, indifferently. Indifference is the end state. It is the point where nothing feels worth defending, yet everything feels to entrench a challenge. Energy collapses inward. Hope becomes private. Survival becomes individualized. And still, life continues. This is the most unsettling part. There is no dramatic rupture to signal transition. The world does not stop. It simply becomes thinner, quieter, more constrained. Looking back, historians will debate dates and decisions, but those living inside it experience something else entirely. They experience a long period where nothing technically breaks, yet nothing truly works. That is how collapse always starts. Not with destruction, but with disconnection. Not with chaos, but with normalization. Not with the end, but with the slow realization that the system no longer remembers why it exists. If this pattern feels familiar, stay with this channel. We keep tracing these quiet structures because noticing them early changes how you see everything.